So, tell me a little bit about your background and stuff. I mean, I got some from Sheriff Mendoza, but
My background is that I was with DEA for 31 years. And I worked abroad for about 18 years, Mexico, Colombia. I was the special agent in charge of the Caribbean division, which included Suriname and Guyana and French Guiana on the South American continent. And then I was the special agent in charge of the San Diego division. And then I was chief of international operations in charge of every office around the world.
wow,
Yeah.
wow.
Plus, I did multinational operations. The biggest one was involved 36 countries. And then after the fall of the Taliban in 2001, I developed an operation where I actually brought in the Chinese and the Russians. So, I have a pretty long
Very
career.
extensive.
Wow, that's awesome. That's awesome. So, how many years total was that?
31.
Wow. And how long have you been retired?
Shortly after Christ resurrected Lazarus. No, it's been a while.
Okay. All right.
But I keep active. I do interviews just about daily. With like Chinese television, Russian television, out of Europe, Latin America. So they come to me when they want to talk about the cartels or issues like fentanyl.
Okay.
Now that I was sitting at the restaurant, I was looking at my phone, and somebody did a documentary about me. I didn't even know they did it.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. That's very, very cool. Well, I mean, thanks for coming and talking to us. I mean,
not a problem.
I think what we're doing, and I hope that this brings you some, I hope this makes you feel good about talking to us, but, we're targeting our community, and we're trying to target our community with information. We're not trying to be the biggest fish out there. We're trying to talk about what's happening in New Mexico and Santa Fe, our home, and, talking to so many people that we've talked to, one of the things that does keep coming up is just the crazy rise in drug use, and just how some of these drugs these days are just like so bad. They just hook people. What can you tell us in general about that here?
Well, the thing is that New Mexico is pretty much being impacted by the Mexican cartels, just like the entire country. So what is happening is through the evolution of the cartels, who originally started dealing with marijuana, heroin, and then in the 1980s, you started to see a shift of cocaine trafficking from the Caribbean to Mexico, because we were hitting the cartels in Colombia very hard. So they started to look at another route, and they figured, okay, let's look at Mexico, because we speak the same language, and they already had existing pipelines into the United States for marijuana and also heroin. So that gave the Mexican cartels a big shot in the arm. Then, when the pharmaceutical companies started to basically flood the United States with Oxycontin and other drugs like Purdue Pharma, that started the opioid crises. And then in 2010, they started to shift from Oxycontin and pharmaceutical drugs into heroin, because it was cheaper. 3 years later, they started to move into fentanyl. And the Mexican cartels are the major supplier for fentanyl to the United States, which includes Mexico. And they've started to shift away from plant-based drugs like opium poppies that produce heroin, and then also marijuana. because synthetic drugs are much easier to produce. They don't get eradicated, by fumigation efforts, so they don't run a great risk. And they're bringing in the precursor chemicals from China. And they bring it in by maritime ship into the Pacific ports, such as Lázaro Cárdenas in Michoacán, and then Manzanillo in the state of Colima, and then also Veracruz on the Atlantic side. The labs, a lot of people here in the United States call them super labs. Not super labs. All they are is a metal tub where they mix the precursor chemicals and they use a stick or a shovel to mix them. So they produce this, with very little effort, very little money, and then what they do is they make counterfeit pills, like oxycodone. And then, it's very easy to smuggle them into the United States. But one of the major problems is that the Mexican cartels, primarily the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, are mixing everything with fentanyl. So that is one of the main reasons that here in the United States we're suffering from about 70,000 deaths just from fentanyl
So
alone.
from ecstasy to cocaine, it's being mixed with fentanyl as well.
Yeah. And the other thing too, that we're starting to see a huge problem, because now they're mixing xylazine with fentanyl. And xylazine is known as the zombie drug. It's an animal tranquilizer. They use it to tranquilize horses, cattle, and they call it the zombie drug because it causes necrosis of the human flesh. It rots the human flesh, which leads to amputations.
Were the Russians calling it crocodile, or is that a separate?
That's a separate drug, but this one they called it short for tranquilizer. So that's the big problem. Now, the other issue is that right now, the relationships between Mexico and the United States are pretty damaged. And they became damaged when DEA arrested the former Secretary of Defense, Salvador Cienfuegos, in 2020. Then you had Trump and that idiot Bill Barr that released him and kicked him back to Mexico with the promise that Mexico was going to prosecute them. They didn't. And I knew that, they released them. And then López Obrador, the Mexican president, said that DEA had fabricated the evidence. They didn't investigate Cienfuegos. And they said, there's no evidence, and they released them.
So that harmed our relationship with
So
Mexico.
that harmed the relationships because López Obrador then imposed sanctions, not only on DEA, but FBI, Homeland Security, ATF, all the agencies working in Mexico. And he said, from now on, you can't go out, you can't work undercover, you can't do this. And the only thing that you can do is gather information and then pass it to the authorities. Well, that's a problem because you have endemic corruption in Mexico, and just giving the information would compromise operations, investigations, informants, and even agents. The other thing that they imposed was that every Mexican official that any U.S. agency contacted, they had to write a report. Well, they're not going to want to write a report or multiple reports every day. So that's going to damage tactical operations, because if you have information that a suspect aircraft is coming up, let's say, for example, up the Caribbean, and it's going to land in southern Mexico, you can't get a hold of anybody, nothing's going to happen. Then they withdrew all diplomatic immunity from all U.S. agencies, and currently they operate in a very, very violent, hostile area.
So you're painting a really, really good picture of like the large scope of things, the relationship between the United States and Mexico, where these drugs are coming from, how they're making them and stuff. Bring that a little closer to home for us. So here we are in New Mexico. You know, we don't have a large population. You know, we have a city and a state where we can see, just from a few years ago, a night and day difference in our own children. So many people.
Well,
that we know.
here's the issue: is that, you know, here in New Mexico, you have had a lot of drug abuse for many decades, and it's pretty much transgenerational, especially here in the northern part of New Mexico, especially with heroin. But with the cartels, you know, they are starting to, you know, look at not only the metropolitan areas, you know, like Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago, Houston. Now they're starting to focus on rural areas, smaller areas, because for fentanyl, they're pretty much untapped. And the ones that are doing that are the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which is the most violent cartel right now in Mexico, set up by an individual by the name of Nemesio Ceguera Cervantes. And they operate very much like a paramilitary force. They wear uniforms, they wear helmets, they have 50 caliber machine guns, they have rocket propelled grenades. So we're not talking about, just a regular, transnational organized crime groups. These are heavily militarized, and they armor vehicles. They've got 50 caliber machine guns mounted on there, and they pose a major national security threat, not only to Mexico, but United States.
So now they're a paramilitary organization.
They function like paramilitary,
Okay.
and
Rank
the
structure.
biggest group that you have operating in New Mexico is the Sinaloa cartel. Sinaloa cartel is headed by a man named Ismael Mayo Zambada, who is an individual who has never spent 1 minute in jail. It's very much like Carlo Gambino of traditional organized crime. Mm-hmm. He's never been captured because he never comes down from the mountains. And the Sinaloa cartel, unlike most criminal organizations, doesn't have a vertical structure. They have a horizontal structure, and they operate very much like McDonald's, where you have decision-making authority that flows along the entire organization. And they have like franchises all over the world, but they have to buy the product from them. They operate in 6 of the 7 continents in the world. They don't operate in Antarctica simply because the penguins don't have any money to buy drugs.
And they are operating in New Mexico is what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think that there's any operation here in Santa Fe?
Oh, yeah. The issue let me start. We have a major problem here in Santa Fe, as well as throughout New Mexico, because we have very powerful cartels in Mexico that have evolved through time. You're not going to be able to counter this problem by being reactive. You have to be proactive. The politicians, for the most part, come in, from Washington, and, unfortunately we have a bunch of idiots, and they come in and they talk about the problem. They have a town hall meeting, they say, we got a problem. We got a lot of overdose deaths, from fentanyl, from heroin, what have you, and they leave. They never offer a solution. And if you notice, recently they came out that the Republicans were going to pass a law that would, provide a lot of criminal sanctions, and, who gives a fuck? These people don't go and look at the laws and say, okay, well, if I traffic fentanyl, I'm gonna get so many years. They don't care. They don't care. They don't think about consequences. Making the laws more harsh is not going to stop anything. They're in it for the profit. They're making massive profits. When you take a look at the death penalty, you know, how many homicides did that stop?
Well, I don't even think we have a death penalty in New Mexico anymore.
No,
It was
but
repealed.
what I'm saying is when we did and when the United States had the death penalty,
Criminals don't look at the consequences
No.
because they don't have any intention of getting caught to begin with, so they don't care about the law.
Exactly. So, you know, a lot of the politicians, they talk about, you know, making the laws harsher for the traffickers, but, you know, they really don't do anything substantive. If you take a look at New Mexico, you have about more or less 147 federal, state, local, municipal, tribal agencies. Most of them don't have any resources. Most of, you know, a lot of them are like, you know, a three-man sheriff's office, you know, a little tiny police department. You know, even Albuquerque has, you know, very, you know, a little tiny anti-drug squad. And the issue is that if you don't have an impact on the drug trade, then you're not going to have an impact on weapons. You're not going to have an impact in terms of human smuggling. You're not going to have an impact on crime because most of it is generated because of the drug trade.
So right now it's just political lip service when it comes to...
Well, the thing is that a lot of it is just political lip service. And the thing is that, you know, most of the people that they put into these positions, you know, their vision stops at the tip of their nose. It's all status quo management. Status quo. They don't come up with strategy. They don't come up with anything that, you know, can have an impact. So, you know, it's going to get worse.
And they don't really consult with, because we're looking at this at a tactical level, right? So at a tactical level, you can make an impact on drug trade with arrests.
Well, it's gonna have to be a broad strategy, not only tactical, but you're gonna have to have a strategic strategy that, you know, will allow the infrastructure here in New Mexico to be developed.
So when the federal government creates a drug czar, it is the responsibility of that drug czar to come up with a strategy to combat.
Yeah, but it's just going to be an overarching strategy. You know, most often than not, you know, they're going to leave it up to the states. Now, yes, they have DEA, FBI, but you know, they're usually very small offices that have a hard time covering, you know, for example, the entire state of New Mexico. But you have to develop the infrastructure here for the state.
Which takes funding.
You can't rely on just the federal agencies. And the key is New Mexico has got to develop it. They need resources, but there's things that you can do, you know, in the meantime.
When I was on the border, what they were saying is happening right now because the cartels really control what's popular nowadays, right? As far as what is available, what are the products that's going to be bought. They were saying right now with the smuggling that's going through, you're not getting a whole lot of big shipments. Instead, you're getting very small shipments coming in. They usually have a stash house in El Paso, and then from there, it's going to be consolidated and then distributed. New Mexico is of key importance because it's a high traffic corridor. That I-25, I-40 is huge because then you can send things up north, east, or west. In your opinion, have things gotten worse when it comes to drug trafficking in New Mexico than it was, say, 5 years ago?
I would say so because, you know, when you deal with fentanyl, you're talking about a major problem area simply because it's 50 times stronger than heroin, 100 times stronger than morphine, and 2 milligrams of fentanyl can be lethal to a normal human being. Then, as I mentioned previously, they're mixing it with everything. So the drug users really have no clue that they're taking fentanyl.
What is the benefit of mixing the fentanyl in
It
with, say, like
prolongs, it prolongs the other drug, and it makes it stronger.
It does.
Probably also starts to low-key get them hooked on something that's even more dangerous than what they're doing. I mean, for example, for a long time, cocaine was a thing, but if they start sneaking that into your cocaine, well, now you have another problem in time. I mean, that would seem to be the case to
Well,
me.
the end result is a eventual death.
It's basically playing Russian roulette. That's why harm reduction efforts are very critical to this, where you have to have Narcan that reverses opioid overdoses. Then you also have to have widespread distribution of test strips, where the drug addicts can test whatever their drug of choice is to make sure that it doesn't have fentanyl. Now, with the mixture of this cocktail of fentanyl and xylazine, the tranquilizer, it doesn't work on xylazine. It's only for opioids.
So this is something that we're currently facing here in New Mexico.
It's starting. It's starting here in New Mexico. It actually started in Puerto Rico. People were using it there.
And they call that the zombie
Drug
yeah.
or trank. They call it trank as well. So then you have a big population of Puerto Ricans in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia actually became the epicenter for xylazine. And, now it's been found in 48 of the 50 states to include New Mexico.
We had an interview with one of our local city council representatives, and we were talking about the issues of drugs. And it's really not a matter of...
Did he know how to spell drugs?
Well, that's a good question. I felt like he was one of the good guys because not everybody's willing to meet with us in our community. But, it's not like have to do a whole lot of... we know where it's at. We see it on Cerrillos Road being sold.
That's exactly right.
It's not like we have to do a whole lot of detective work to know where it's at.
We could take you here. We could take you right now to a handful of spots in Santa Fe, and we will show you where it is. And it's frustrating for us.
And I guess this is where it comes down to it. Is the state? It feels like the state of New Mexico or the city of Santa Fe and their prosecutors and DAs aren't really taking this as serious as they should be. Because give it 2 more years, we might get to a level that's uncontrollable. We have a humanitarian aid crisis taking place in New Mexico, where we have a massive amount of the population that are dying off from fentanyl and from some of these from trank. Mm-hmm. And all we get is this political lip service from our elected representatives, who often forget that they are representatives and that they are elected.
So what do they tell you here in Santa Fe?
What's that, sir?
What do they tell you here in Santa Fe?
Well, it's kind of the same old thing. It's like, well, we need to look into this. We need to figure out where it's coming
And
from.
yes, we've got a problem here.
And this is something that all of us have to be a part of.
Yeah, we all need to be part of this.
So we all, the community, we have to be all invested in the community in order to do this. But for example, the state of New Mexico at one point, and I was with the National Guard here many years ago, and I was doing counter-drug operations. We had a counter-drug on the border in Santa Teresa, and we were working with the Border Patrol. We were using some of our FLIR systems, and we were helping spot drug smugglers' mules coming in through the border. We would call in Border Patrol, and they would seize loads coming in. Mm-hmm. This current administration, we no longer have counter-drug from the National Guard helping on the borders. So, I wonder, at what level is it where it becomes beyond just incompetence, where it's almost like, hey, are you doing this on purpose? Because that's when I start to question it, and, or is this happening on purpose?
I think the problem is that a lot of times they don't have a strategy. And, they put, and, I don't want to, start criticizing, the heads of police agencies or whatever, because I got to work with them. But they put a lot of these people, and I would say 98% of them, if not 100% of them, have no strategy. It's all status quo. They'll go in and, let everything flow as it is. Never mind that, you have a pandemic, a crisis, dealing with fentanyl and other drugs, but they don't know how to develop strategies. I know how to develop strategies because I've done, operations involving 36 countries, the biggest one. But that's why I'm helping the Crime Commission now, voluntarily, just to help my home state, because I grew up here in New Mexico. But that's the problem, is that they don't have a strategy. They don't know how to, bring desperate agencies. And then you have a lot of fucking idiots, like these constitutional sheriffs that don't want to enforce certain laws. So it becomes a quagmire. And, once it starts to hit hard, they might take a few more measures. But, when you take a look at Santa Fe Police Department, they're used to basically doing traffic, State police, they do have, narcotics units, but they're used to like little buys. A gram here, a fix here, whatever, and then their investigative components leave a lot to be desired. So that's the problem.
It feels like we are quickly becoming a very lawless state on all aspects.
Well, I think that, it can be, you can have an impact, but, again, see what happens.
So I look at like El Paso, and it was, I go and I train in El Paso every month. So El Paso is like a second home. I thought El Paso would be a very violent city. Now, although the violence is on the rise now because they are currently having a lot of problems, but El Paso was controlled by the cartels. So that means all the street gangs all want to do business, but they're not allowed to do business for themselves. Because you start going into business for yourself, then you become a problem. And what they don't want is unneeded violence in the streets of El Paso, which is going to grab the attention of law enforcement on all sides. So it was relatively controlled, all the street gangs. Everybody wanted to make business, so you didn't see a whole lot of property crimes. You didn't see a whole lot of shootings that took place in the streets of El Paso. It goes, you want to kill somebody, you go across the bridge. New Mexico's different, because New Mexico, we have the street gangs. Street gangs are getting their shipments and making business on their own. Then we have opportunist groups that are operating property crimes, robberies, and just the overall level of violence that's taken place. I've looked at the crime stats for the last couple of years for Albuquerque. For the most part, they've been pretty transparent with their data. And it is an increase in rising crime in the last 4 years. The city of Santa Fe, I've had some problems with because the city of Santa Fe has not released their crime data for the last couple of years. And you're actually supposed to, you get federal funding if you release that crime data to, what is it, the database?
Yeah, to the FBI,
Yes, sir.
crime
Crime data.
Uniform crime reports.
So they had not done that. And then when I received finally the crime data for the last 5 years or 3 years, it was a one sheet. It was a one spreadsheet. And it broke up crime into different categories from violent crimes, drug-related crimes.
Well, do
all
they
those
have
things.
anybody within the PD that keeps or is in charge of keeping those stats?
Well, what has
Or
happened...
do they not have enough personnel to do it?
That's ultimately what they're saying, is that they don't have enough personnel to do it, or it's an undue burden on on the city of Santa Fe. Now, ultimately, that doesn't garner a whole lot of
But,
confidence.
you really don't need, those crime stats because, you as a citizen, you're going to see the impact, that's taking place within the city.
And I think I totally agree with you, because you can show me data right now and you can skew it however you want that actually makes it look like our crime has been lowered in the last couple of years. But what we see on the streets and what we're experiencing is totally different.
Yeah. Well, the citizens are going to feel the crime. And, many times, you have police departments that skew the crime stats or they limit it. Even Mexico does it. For example, they have, tens of thousands of homicides every year. And then what they did is they started to lower them by saying, okay, well, if somebody came in and killed 5 people in this room, they would, call it one homicide because it was all one event.
Yes, sir.
So that happens.
Let me just switch gears here, just out of left field. What do you think the correlation is between our homeless community and this drug epidemic that we have?
I think that there's a lot of homeless people that are using drugs. And I think that they are homeless because many use drugs, and a lot of the families will kick him out of the house because they start stealing from the families, or they also have mental problems. So yes, I think that a lot of the homeless people consume drugs. Not all of them. I'm not going to say that all of them do, but a lot of times they will do that because of the anxiety of not knowing where their next meal is going to come from, having to live out in a tent on the outskirts of Santa Fe, in the dead of winter sometimes, because a lot of them, even though shelters are available, they don't go to shelters. So the community and the politicians have really got to step up to the plate and not only discuss the problem but look at solutions. They need to look at solutions. I recognize the fact that a lot of the police departments in the state don't have a lot of resources. So resources have to be provided. I'm not familiar with the budget here in New Mexico, but instead of looking at pork barrel spending, look at saving lives. We need to start saving lives. We need to start curbing the abuse of drugs, because we can't always rely on reliable partners in throughout the world that are producing these drugs, because you have politicians that will come in and they may not want to cooperate with you. We have a situation in Colombia right now where you have a former subversive, Gustavo Petro, that is now the president. So he doesn't want to really eradicate a lot of the coca crops. And now they're producing over 500,000 acres of coca plants. I mean, it's really increased. So he doesn't want to deal with glyphosate because of its carcinogenic properties, but at the same time he doesn't want to hurt these subsistence farmers. So we need to look at really reducing the demand, because if we don't reduce the demand, if it's not Mexico and it's not Colombia, it's going to be another country, because we're dealing with a basic law of supply and demand. And as long as we have the demand here, you're going to have somebody doing the supply.
Yeah, I've seen some people that I know firsthand, many of them in our community, and it seems like this fentanyl and some other drugs are just so addictive these days. They're just so hooked. They will allow their baby to starve. They will allow their baby to be born in withdrawal. They will leave the house with their small. I mean, I use the the baby thing because I've seen it, and it's such human nature to love your offspring, but there's nothing that they won't do for that next hit, and they know very well that it could kill them, and they've accepted it. And so when you have that happening more and more and more in mass, and you see these people become homeless, and you see how tragic that is on so many levels, and you see it on such a large scale, it's just frustrating to see it get worse. And especially and I'm sorry, but especially with our city leaders, some of them, when you ask them, they say, well, it's not as bad as it seems because, you've seen this, and so this is your experience, and so you're maybe a little tainted because it's not that bad.
Well, I look at it as being bad if you have one individual that died from a drug overdose. That's bad. But when you have a lot of consumption, especially of deadly drugs like fentanyl, that does cause a lot of the homelessness, but even more so the neglect of children, and the children living with the parents, in these tents, not having enough food, and being neglected because when people are addicted to drugs, they don't even care for themselves, their hygiene, their health. So how are they going to care for a child? And that's a tragic situation. And I find it very tragic when you have city leaders that are saying, oh, it's not as bad as you think it is. That is basically telling you that they are not going to make an effort to take this problem head on. So they deny, and then when it becomes a crisis, they try to react. But that's like trying to react to a 12-car crash and trying to pull people out of the burning cars. It's not going to really help you.
Yeah.
So they need to step up to the plate. And here's the thing, is that we as citizens, if elected leaders are not doing what they're supposed to do, we need to stop voting them into office, term after term after term. Vote them out. Get somebody else that is going to come in and do something about the problems that these cities in New Mexico face. This is the same thing in Congress. They do nothing, and the thing is that we keep voting them in year after year after year, and some of these leaders, I wouldn't even have them lead a Girl Scout troop to sell Girl Scout cookies in front of a post office.
Well, there is a cognitive dissonance that goes on with politics, because we live in a day and age where everything is very polarized.
Yeah.
If you're a Democrat, you can only have liberal values. If you're a Republican, you can only be conservative. There's no space for any moderation anymore. And the unfortunate aspect of it, if we're talking about a Lindsey Graham or, say, a Chuck Schumer, there's no difference. There is no difference between these people.
You're right. I think that, we have become a divided country, but just because we're divided doesn't mean that measures and steps can be undertaken to resolve a lot of these issues.
Through education?
Through education, and then also legislation. For example, talking about weapons, why do we need military-grade weapons? And the thing is that a lot of our politicians are in the pocket of the National Rifle Association. Now, we have more mass shootings, and mass shootings are where 2 or more people are killed or injured than we have days in the year. Now, a lot of these politicians profess to be pro-life, But, how hypocritical can you be if you're pro-life? Why don't you want to control weapons that are killing so many people in the United States, to include children?
So we have a political gridlock within our country and a massive destabilization of infrastructure in this. I mean, America's falling apart.
Well, it is, and just the political rhetoric. We can't get any effective legislation passed. Then you have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, that if you put her gray matter in a mid-sized canary, it'd fly an inverted pattern.
I got a quick question for you. How political is law enforcement? And could it be more effective if, for the DEA, for the FBI, for city police forces, to have no political influence whatsoever?
Well, they would be much more effective, because really you need the cooperation of all law enforcement agencies, for example, at the federal, state, local, municipal, tribal level. Unfortunately, a lot of times you don't have that. For example, in the past, you didn't have that type of cooperation between Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office and Albuquerque Police Department. Now that you have new people there, the relationships have started to gel. But here in New Mexico, you have constitutional sheriffs that feel that there are certain laws they're not going to enforce. Well, as a law enforcement professional, you cannot be selective in terms of what laws you're going to enforce and what laws you're going to ignore. Like when they passed the red flag laws, some of them say, oh, we're not going to enforce that. Oh, we're not going to do that. Well, then go find a job as a truck driver. Because if you're not going to enforce the laws, then you shouldn't be there. But then you also have competition between the agencies, and that competition sometimes does not allow for a cohesive or unified focus in terms of crime.
Everyone's looking for funding from the federal source.
Well,
or the state,
not only
for the
that, but
departments.
looking at, okay, well, who's going to take credit for this operation or this investigation and what have you. So there's a lot of friction, but if you don't have a whole of government approach to crime, to drug trafficking, what have you, you're going to be behind the power curve.
Do you think like a chief of police should not be an appointed position, but they should hire a chief of police from within the department, as opposed to a mayor selecting a chief of police?
I think that it doesn't matter as long as you select somebody that is capable, somebody that has a strategic type of vision, somebody that's going to do their job. And a lot of times I don't agree when the mayor puts a chief of police, because normally what they're going to do is they're going to select somebody that is going to do their bidding.
The rule of reciprocity.
And it's going to go into, I don't want you to do that. I want you to do this. I don't want you to focus on this. I want you to focus on that. But at the same time, when you have elected officials, it's done by popular vote. And it's like, oh, well, I know him, he's a good guy. My aunt, babysat this individual, and, it's really good. And it has nothing to do with credentials. And that is a huge problem as well.
I got nothing more for you.
Sir, I just want to thank you for sitting down with us and
Well, not a
sharing
problem.
I just can't tell you enough how much I appreciate you driving down.
Well, not a
You're a
problem.
busy and a popular guy, and you have a ton of expertise. And we're just trying to. We're busy guys. We have our own lives, our own jobs, our own stuff. Filmmaking is a hobby for us, and we're pretty good at it. But we're
Well,
just trying to affect our community for good. Is all we're trying to do.
Well, the thing is that, it's a good project, and I applaud you, because I think that public awareness is a big thing, and that's one of the things that I'm recommending to the commission is public awareness. And, you know, you have a lot of